Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to do things a little bit differently as I want to do a different kind of format for these reviews. This will also probably be the last review I do for a series for a while, as it's becoming increasingly difficult not to do any spoilers. But with that being said, we're about to review Leslie Shu's Kumasagi Book 3, Wife. The first two books in this series were more standalone than this book. And while the first book focused more on Najat, the Kumasagi, and the second book on Jayan, his brother, the third book, while it does have more focus on Asta, Jayan's wife, it's not as pronounced as the other two characters in the previous two books. So let's begin at the start of the story. Asta is seeking out the dean of Jayan's university in order to see if she's heard any news about him. This is covered in the events of the second book, in which Jayan leads an expedition in an attempt to tame a lopperbeak, a giant murder bird. Unfortunately, the only news that the dean has heard has been negative, as two of the members of the expedition have died. However, Jayan is still alive and is on his way back. Asta, being the wonderfully naive little girl that she is, actually made cardamom cookies for the dean and the various people who work with her as attempted bribery and peacemaking. And it might be just me, but the dean always seems to come across a little bit harsh. We immediately cut over to Najat, who is undergoing some more intensive training with the Kumasagi. The Kumasagi, of course, being the senior member of the ruling elite of their religion. Both men astral project to their god, the great skyfish, but this time is a little bit different. The Kumasagi leads Najat to the tail of the fish, where all the Forsaken souls desperately attempt to reunite with their god. However, emotions like grief, sadness, betrayal prevent them from being able to reach him. The Kumasagi attempts to show Najat how to cleanse these spirits, at least some of the closer ones, so that they may rejoin with the skyfish. Najat, however, seems less than pleased, as all the Kumasagi is doing is simply removing their guilt and not dealing with it. Najat starts trying to deal with the trauma of some of the nearby spirits, only to be reprimanded by the Kumasagi. Najat unfortunately does not listen and gets a little bit carried away, losing himself in the process. Eventually he hears something calling out to him from further back beyond the tail. He runs across a soul who shares a similar past to himself, as both of them were master divers at their own respective lakes. However, the soul he runs across has a much more tragic story. He lost not only his lake, but his Amala, and the very last husk that was supposed to be a destined from that lake. The soul has been chasing the skyfish for almost 500 years, and despite Najat's best efforts, he cannot cleanse the spirit of its grief. He instead has to recruit his own Amala in order to help alleviate the grief that this soul is experiencing. However, it isn't until after the soul is purified that Najat has several questions he realizes he wished to ask the man. Unfortunately now the man does not remember his past, since he has been purified and is returned to the skyfish. We return to Asta in her attempt to reunite with her sisters. An attempt that is being hampered by her crippling shyness and inability to speak properly. She returns to the temple in which she was raised, and to the grotto in which her and Najat had the initial incident, which has led to her developmental problems as they are. The grotto contains a spring which helps identify mystics, but when Asta scoops the water into her hands, instead of glowing, it glows for but a mere second and dims almost immediately, becoming cloudy and then clear. This disheartens her until she meets one of the acolytes, who informs her that they believe that she is indeed a mystic. Asta protests, saying that she could not be, as she failed all the tests when she was a destined. But the acolyte informs her there are many other types of mystics. After a pleasant conversation with the acolyte, Asta leaves on her own, and in her seclusion attempts to test her powers, reaching out to somebody else. She is unfortunately met with confusion and grief which she doesn't understand. When she returns home, she finds a letter from her husband asking her to meet him in Orsiana, a major milestone on his expedition. Almost serendipitously, the dean appears once again. The dean pretty much forces Asta to go on this expedition. and it seems a little self-serving as the dean's only real motivation is to get Jayan back and doing his job. Unfortunately, Jayan is not a good husband and did not put his wife's name on the bank account, so she literally has no money. She was left with so little money, in fact, she's almost starving. The dean, unhindered by this, arranges for Asta to travel with another group who are going to grieve some of the members of the expedition who died. The woman on the trip takes a great liking to Asta, and in the short time that they are together and when they arrive at the city, they give her some money and tell her to go see some of the sights of this magnificent city. In fact, we covered a little bit in Book 2, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on it. But Asta, when left to her own devices for 3 days waiting for her husband, actually spends her time at the Medical Arts Center looking after the young boys there. When Jayan and Asta finally do reunite, it's marred by the fact that they aren't actually going home as Asta had originally intended and had promised the dean. Jayan is unfortunately as bad an employee as he seems to be a husband. They take what is quite possibly the longest and most circuitous route home, stopping off at several of the local lakes and sightseeing, taking a trip that should have taken 2 or 3 days in about maybe 2 or 3 weeks. Time is a little bit hard to keep track of in this series. Now that they're home, Jayan has to face an inquiry at work because 2 of the members of his expedition died, and 2 of the students that he took with him were injured, one even losing an arm. Jayan seems vaguely upset about this, but not to the point of actually rectifying his ways. Asta is left to her own devices once again, and she returns to the temple in an attempt to find out more information about her sisters, to see if she can't find their addresses. A little more confident in her budding mystic abilities, she decides to reach out and see if she can communicate with Najat. She finds Najat meditating, and after trying to get his attention several times and failing, decides to have her astral form actually touch him. Unfamiliar with the term "let sleeping dogs lie," she is instantly teleported to Najat's mental location, which is at the tail of the skyfish. And unlike Najat, she is not prepared for the scene. The spirits of the tormented and dead are not pretty things to look at, with tentacles and jagged legs sticking out of them at odd angles, attempting to get attention and crying out in pain. Something reminiscent of an East Asian horror movie from the sounds of it. She immediately loses balance and falls back to Earth, leaving Najat to come after her quickly. And this is where I'm going to wrap up the recap. Normally I would go a little longer, but I'm trying my best to avoid spoilers, and this book is full of spoilers from the previous 2 books. So let's get into the things I like and the things that I didn't. First of all, I really like the race of people in this book. I feel like they would make a fantastic D&D race. They have a rich, complicated history, a magic system that is integral to their lives to the point of extinction if they were to ignore it, and a complex societal structure. Further, there's a little mystery with the skyfish. One of the landmarks they use to mark when they're at the tail is one large dun-colored scale that has a chip in it, which makes me curious as to what could have left the chip. This is a god, after all, and as far as we know, there are no other gods in the series. However, there are other astral beings. I'm hoping this is something that will be explored in a bit more detail later. There's also an interesting detail to color in this. Different people are born of different lakes. This leads to a wide variety in the coloring of the skin, of the hair, of the eyes, and of the scales at their wrists, ankles, and backs. And it's a wild range of colors, from black to green to blue to bronze and silver and white. And the colors don't seem to stay consistent through family members, though they are consistent through the lakes, and affects to a great degree who can marry and who can shed within the lakes, both integral parts of their life cycles. Also, the Kumasagi is becoming one of my favorite characters, mainly because he's just a crotchety old man trying to deal with a student who's a little bit more headstrong than he's really ready to deal with. I do have a few nitpicks with the story though, and these are small things. First of all, the love between Jayan and Asta feels a little forced. Now that's not to say it's not understandable. This is not a society that's built on romantic love. Given how mating is carried out in this world, the actual interaction between these two I would expect to be a little bit stiff at first, and Giant has been gone more than he's been present during their marriage. The second nit I'm going to pick is that the perspective shifts a little too much. Sometimes it can be a little bit hard to tell what perspective we're looking at or what characters we're dealing with. It's not story breaking, but it did make me go back and reread paragraphs a few times, thinking I might have missed something. Again, it's not a big thing. It's something that could be fixed with a page break. So who is this story for? It's a bit of a tough question. I feel like with the large amount of interpersonal relationships and the focus on characters, this may be geared more towards the female eye than the male eye. That's not to say that if you're male you're not going to get enjoyment out of the series. I particularly enjoyed the second book. This feels more like a couple read. Something that if you were trying to get your girlfriend into reading, or your girlfriend wanted you to both read the same kind of book to talk about, that you would both settle on. It has a little bit for the both of you, and it will give you plenty to talk about. This is also not a very long book. I finished it in roughly 6 hours. It was a fun little story that kept me entertained for an afternoon, and I can't really think of anywhere that it actually dragged. Unlike the first book, this is not standalone. You will definitely have wanted to read the first 2 books before you pursue it. But with that being said, I will leave you all to your reading.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to my review. If you enjoyed it, you can find others on my YouTube, BitChute, and Odyssey channels. If you are an independent author and would like a chance at having a review, I have master lists on Minds, Gab, and Twitter pinned at the top of my feed. Please leave your book name, the way you would like readers to contact you, and a place where you can be reached and your work can be found. Thank you.